And so today we're going to go over task forces and working groups. So working groups, task force, advisory groups, subcommittee, commissions, these are all terms that you probably hear when we're talking about task forces and working groups, and they're often used interchangeably, but we're mainly going to be speaking about task forces and working groups. So some main aspects of a task force are the specific goals, and those are what the task force seeks to address, the members and their affiliated groups, and the final report of the committee, which all of these are detailed in the public act of the task force. And so for the specific goals, what is the purpose of a task force? Is pretty much to identify the topic or issue that a task force aims to address. These groups provide the additional time necessary to discuss issues outside of session with the goal of bringing together stakeholders who produce recommendations to our legislators, committees, or agencies. The Public Act will outline the goal of the task forces, and most of the time, task forces are created for legislation that was toned down in order to get it passed and will be reexamined with additional information in the following sessions. Memberships who serves on the task force, legislation creating the task force will spell out the requirements of the members who appoints them. Generally, appointments are made by leadership of the four caucuses. These groups bring together agency, legislators, advocates, lobbyists, and experts to discuss their given topic and propose recommendations to the legislative committee that has cognizance over that topic, and the final report. A final report from the task force is submitted to a legislative committee. This report contains the studies, reference materials, and recommendations that the group discussed and compiled during their meetings. The statute does provide the deadline for the submission of the report. So, it's really important to read the statute beforehand just to know what the purpose was, the goal of the task force, the members, and then the deadlines.
So getting a task force started. So once a task force is passed in statute, it doesn't automatically start. Appointments need to be made, chairs need to be appointed. So it's really helpful if, as a legislator who maybe was the proponent of a task force, it's something that you worked really hard on, it would be really helpful to get this task force off the ground if you followed up with appointing authorities who are all outlined in the statute. You could also follow up with the organizations and agencies that are outlined in the statute who are supposed to have members on the task force. And this just helps things get things off the ground and get started. And staffing for the task forces and working groups. So usually committee staff, so the clerks, assistant clerks if they're around, are designated either informally or through legislation to be the administrative support for the task forces. And the task forces and commissions and working groups are usually run in the off session, though there are some that will run for a couple years, and so they'll be ongoing. And so again, usually it's the committee clerks who will staff the task force. Sometimes it'll be leadership staff or caucus staff. It depends on what is in statute or what is designated informally. As for the role of staff, it's basically the same roles that a committee staff would have for their actual committee, organizing meetings, putting together agendas and minutes, uploading all of those materials onto the task force website. The biggest responsibilities would be organizing those meetings, organizing the Zoom, hosting it, and also acting as a main point of contact for the task force and keeping track of all the members. And so the task force webpage, you can find this through the CGA website. If you go to the committee, the appropriate committee's webpage, at the very bottom, there's a section that says task forces, and then you'd be able to find whichever task force you're looking for in that section. And when you click on that, you get to the webpage, which lists task force membership. There are dates for every meeting that's been held, and under those dates, there will be agendas, minutes, presentations, any other materials that might have been shared at that meeting. There's also staff contact information, again, usually the clerk of the appropriate committee. Additionally, recordings of past task force meetings are usually found on the YouTube channel for the committee. And if CTN covered the task force meeting, then it can also be found on CTN's website. And finally, helpful contacts. So if you have any questions about a task force, if there have been appointments made, when meetings might be held, the best contact would be the clerk or the administrator of the appropriate committee. You can also reach out to OLR for research on task forces. They also can provide clarification on what statute says about that task force and its charge and members and such. And the legislative library also keeps track of every task force, past and present. So they have a record of all of the task forces, all of their appointments, and they also have record of reports. So if you're ever looking for a report from a task force that has concluded, you would be able to find it through the legislative library. And we're going to just quickly show you how to get to a task force webpage. So from the main CGA homepage, if you go to committees, and then under committees, you pick the appropriate committee. Let's go to education. And then all the task forces would be listed at the very bottom under task forces. And let's go to the special ed task force, because that's the one I've been working on. And so this is what a task force webpage would look like. You can see membership on the top right there. Click on it. And so you'd be able to see the current members. And if we go back, there's the contact information. And then if you scroll to the bottom, there are dates for all of the past meetings. There's the agenda for the last meeting this week. I haven't uploaded minutes yet because I just haven't finalized them yet. But if you go to maybe the first meeting, there's the agenda, there's the minutes. I think the second meeting I had uploaded a presentation. So any materials that might have been shared at that meeting should be available through the webpage. And that's it.
Who would I talk to about appointments being made to any task force, for like House Dems, for example?
So there are a couple of people you could go to. You could go to the clerk. Usually they should be made aware of them. But if the clerk doesn't know, Chris Jackson is usually aware of all of the appointments that are made.
I'm aware of a number of task forces that have declined to meet. So who is really accountable for that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, some task forces don't meet because they don't get the appropriate appointments made. And so, like I mentioned earlier, it's really important for any legislators that really championed these task forces getting passed to follow up with appointing authorities. And us as clerks also do that following up. And if they don't meet, it's simply on the legislator who wanted this task force or working group to get together to at least try to maybe reintroduce it in another session to extend their deadline for the report if that's something that was required.
Yeah, my concern is that it's not that legislators want a task force, it's that they didn't get the bill that, so it was basically downgraded to a task force of the proposal as a way of passing it, like you said. So, the issue is still, pending or whatever. And it seems like there isn't necessarily momentum to have the task force. There's momentum to have the policy that it's been downgraded to a task force. And I'm wondering, is that default of just not meeting a way to let the task force die and then try to reintroduce the policy the next session?
It could be. Again, if there really wasn't any energy behind really getting the task force to meet, then that's, I guess, just how it is. And if someone were to really want it to meet and, have discussions about its charge and make recommendations that could turn into legislation, then it's on the legislator who wants that to try to make those follow-ups and get the appointments made so that they can meet.
I have a question. You're familiar with my issues because you've been on this task force for me. And I'm also serving on another task force, which was quickly impaneled, had all of the necessary assignments, and even had our first organizational meeting and are continuing with a deadline of January. The task force that I've been talking to you about, which is the Civics Engagement Task Force, is very slow in getting its various assignments done. I think this question was asked earlier, but I'm having a little trouble with my screen here. So I'm looking at the education website and where these task forces are listed, but I can't see the full screen. Two things, Rosalie. One is, who is ultimately responsible for making sure these task forces get fully filled in a timely way? I mean, it's House and Senate, General Assembly question. And number two, if some of these slots on these task forces require certain criteria, if they don't have any success in finding individuals that are, say, members of a particular organization or a particular trade union or whatever, what happens then? I mean, is it something where they can modify the requirements or loosen the eligibility? How would that work? In other words, who's ultimately responsible for making sure all these task forces are put together and set out their legislative requirements in the coming session?
So On your first question, I think that would be something to talk about with the chairs to if you really want a task force to get together and it's just not happening, then you would talk to the chairs and again follow up with the appointing authorities. And as for your second question in terms of not being able to find someone, again, that would if you can find if you have like, recommendations for an appointment that has not been made yet and the appointing authority is having trouble finding someone, then you can certainly make that recommendation. Otherwise, we have amended task force membership in statute before. I know one of mine actually just had some added and clarified. So that is something that could also be changed in statute. But again, talking to the chairs and talking to the appointing authorities.
Those are really good answers from Rosalie. Normally, if an appointing authority doesn't have a direct connection to a person who fits the criteria, a lot of times advocacy groups who are interested in passing legislation, but ultimately it became a task force on a certain policy topic, they would recommend people. And I know in different instances, they've conducted, the appointing authorities will conduct interviews and then choose based off of those recommendations and interviews.